Thank you, Naresh and Mehdi and team for bringing API Days to India as a first, and for making all of us from overseas so hugely welcome here. I arrived early in the morning yesterday and organised an Uber to get here. I was thinking about this as an example of APIs everywhere. This was an account that I originally set up when I lived in Australia, using obviously a Stripe-type API to get to my bank account there. I can now use the other bank accounts that I have now live in the UK. And I was using that application to get a car in Bengaluru for several years later from an experience in an app that I could just use from my phone. And I think if somebody had said even 15 years ago that that would be the type of way that one would do a business trip like this, you might not have thought that that would have perhaps been so possible. And of course, that's APIs are behind all of that. They are absolutely everywhere, and they are delivering huge gains and huge abilities for people to be able to scale, for organizations to move into new business models, to operate in new and imaginative ways that didn't exist before. As they do that, they're also scaling at potentially a cost to the way that people impact with the environment, to roles, and productivity savings can often be interpreted as people saving jobs, which may mean people and families don't have an income. It could be that using technology, making things run faster, ask more and more creative queries and interest can have an effect on energy uses and ultimately the environment. These are all big picture questions and conversations that people are trying to have and have sensible answers to, and be able to balance that with the desire for scale and growth and impact. If you look at something like building a suspension bridge, many of us might see ourselves as part of a component of a bigger ecosystem play, as we are part of pouring concrete or part of making change. But you can tell even just driving from the airport to somewhere like here, how most infrastructure building projects are also happening on top of a lot of legacy processes and ways of working and ways of living. And we're trying to manage all of that at the same time. So this matters because here, as I understand it, in India, largest population in the world, you are already hugely active in the digital economy, and the pace at which you undertake and innovate and build new ideas, and Naresh has been sharing a lot of this with me, means that you are able to use and focus on this tech to make a big impact quickly and in all of the right types of things. But at that, we do need to make sure that as we're focusing on the tech, and the conference like this is a lot about how to make that tech useful and appropriate, is how do we make it ethically and responsible. The expectations on how much of a difference we can make, how much we can save, how fast we can go, we have to ask ourselves if that's realistic, and does that speed come at any cost, and what is that? So why would I be able, if you like, qualified to talk to you about this? I've been helping organizations understand and navigate value from and justification in technology for more than 30 years, and that equates to having either consulted or been consulted to in usually large and incumbent industries, but I have also worked and helped schools, hospitals, manufacturers, distribution, businesses. Latter years, it's mainly been financial services, but I've had the ability to live in 4 continents. I have worked in enough different industries that I can help my clients and the people that I'm working with see connections between the different ways that people work and the different types of languages and communications that make up this massive API economy. I was talking to someone just on Tuesday in Australia about the potential for what the API economy was meaning for them in their no longer a startup, a scale-up organization that has interconnections with banks, with telcos, with startups, and they were saying that one of their biggest challenges from an API perspective is keeping the language the same. If you go and talk to a startup about infrastructure, they'll typically have in the back of their mind AWS, Azure, that infrastructure as code. If you're talking to a government department, infrastructure could be roads and railways. If you talk to someone on the trading desk in markets, which I've also done, infrastructure means all of the business processes and systems that sit behind an interest rate derivative traded product. So they'll say, oh, do we have all of the infrastructure ready? Which actually means, do we have the middle office and the back office operations? I've just chose that one word. It's one that we all use all the time. But you can see that if you are part of this API economy participation, you're talking about working and using technology to leverage in different industries, different ways, that your language becomes really important. If we were to focus on a definition for the API economy, this is one that I've been using in these API economy summit conversations that we've been having with practitioners. It is all about this participation. Either participating in other organizations, business processes and tech, or being a participant in somebody else's. I'll give you an example. Worked with organizations in industries like insurance. So a large incumbent insurer in business is likely to have always had strategies around how they reach into new markets. So they might want to sell their products. Originally, they used to distribute them through brokers, through maybe then they extended out to working through airlines or for travel. Or now they're looking more and more at delivering APIs as a way of doing more than just white label, as they'd say, white label sell more of their product. They're talking about actually embedding some of that capability that somebody else might be able to use in another way. So you could have an insurance product, let's say driving car insurance, which for a large incumbent insurer, it might be quite expensive to define very niche products of that to very niche industries. But there could be a mobility platform provider who is looking to service, let's say, for example, an older market of drivers, and by taking a niche insurance product, specializing for people from 55 to, or 60 to 80 or something like that, that they can offer that a great experience for those people who might be low digital take-up, and do that with perhaps a cost associated with supporting it that the big insurer couldn't do. So they will take, as an API product, that example, but it could be that that mobility platform, this startup, scale-up that's offering this niche insurance, has now got some really interesting information that could be of benefit to the healthcare industry to understand the driving behaviours of that older population of their client base. They could also perhaps be of interest to some of the government people that are thinking about some of the road use and infrastructure. So there are APIs that platform provider may be able to provide in a way that other sectors could use. Likewise, back to our big insurer, they may have chosen to unbundle some of their capability and get API-delivered functionality from, let's say, for accounting, et cetera, and those types of processes. So what we've got is these becoming ever more complex ecosystems and patterns that are coming to life every day and brought about by APIs. And if we are in any one of these, we're often needing to not just understand the language of our ecosystem, or the one perhaps that's one step removed, but sometimes we're actually also needing to be able to understand the language that these people's customers are wanting, or their types of data and systems in terms of how they're consumed by others. So just going to check, how many people here work in an organization of more than, let's say, 1,000 people? Okay, most of the group. Keep your hands up if it's 10,000 people or more. Okay, also a large part of the group. Of the others, how many of you work for an organization that might have a B2B connection with an organization of more than 1,000 or 10,000. So is there anybody who hasn't put their hand up yet? Okay, one or two. But I think you can see that for most of us, even if we're not in this world, which I'm assuming is kind of a larger, complex, incumbent world, we may well be in one of these other worlds that is interrelating with it, which is where the people aspects come into play. And we're in these organizations, we're not just looking for feedback loops where value exchanged between these different entities, but also feedback loops that are going to come from other places than we would traditionally think of, and that needs language. If our process for understanding how those strategies play out to inform our API designs are very linear, so if we have what I would call handoffs that are from one team to another, that cascading from some kind of on-high strategy, flowing down to eventually an API spec at the end, and we don't have some of these feedback loops, we end up at risk of losing sight of the big picture, but also not being able to innovate quickly enough. And so this is one of the things that I work a lot with organizations, is how to help them manage some of these feedback loops, which are not necessarily binary, but are actually fairly circular. They're the table stakes, if you like, for innovation. Then there's the harder stuff, which is once you've got this kind of concept, how do you actually navigate changes in the way people think, their attitudes, their behaviors, to be able to operate in this new world? Because it is very different. And why is it different? It actually requires you to think differently about how you articulate your strategy. It is different in terms of how you might traditionally justify tech. If you're in a large organization, it's often gone through a traditional role. And there's a difference in the way that you think about your API products being designed and sustained. I'm going to go and talk about each of these. One of the assumptions that we often have, either within large organizations or if we're working with them, is we think that everybody kind of gets some of these API concepts. I'm assuming that everybody's here because they're working with it day to day. And it's almost like it's kind of like somebody using information in a new creative way, integrating a system this way. It's kind of therefore. But often, actually, people don't have all of the answers, and there isn't this kind of group called the business who somehow got all of the results. In my experience, what there are is a lot of people who are keen to learn, keen to understand what these concepts might mean, how they might be able to create value from them, but they need our help to be able to articulate what that looks like. There's also a bit of I think sometimes a false assumption that there is a very straight line between we want to do this in the business, we want to move into this market, we want to make this kind of play opportunity, and here is therefore the technology that we need to make it happen. But I think any of us working in large organizations or with them would recognize that that is actually often a much more bumpy line, and it involves a lot of feedback. So we could have some great ideas as API professionals or people who understand systems and data at the infrastructure, down at the low level, that we are wanting to be able to communicate and feed back ahead of, rather than having things cascaded down. Is this, out of interest, I'm just checking, is this resonating for people? Does it sound familiar? A couple of nods. So we need to start getting people to think more about product as the tech industry understands it, which we can learn a lot from those that start up and scale up, than what I would call the traditional project thinking. And we also have an assumption often that the funding for APIs and even API management, the tooling and the platforms that support great API goals are in there for the long term. But in fact, what we often find is that people have very high expectations of what an API management platform and what APIs can deliver without really understanding that it's a long term. It's not a do once and forget. API capabilities are long term. One of the things that people often start with when they're trying to educate more of their stakeholders to get more on board with this API economy piece, because the lines aren't always that clear, is they'll start with, well, look at Twilio and Stripe, and those are all the great examples, and everybody go, I would like some of that. It's certainly worth remembering that what would now be considered the big 5 true API revenue earners already have an annual recurring revenue combined of over, they estimate, 30 billion US. And both OpenAI and Anthropic are recent players in that, and they have already accelerated up. So we think of ChatGPT as the main output, but it's actually the ability to be able to connect that capability into others and embed that functionality, which has been the major piece behind it. And I often think that doesn't get as much recognition as it could or should, but it's often a great place to start with educating stakeholders and then thinking about and helping them understand that they have to think differently. This is a conversation I find that I have a lot still, that if you are leading a business in an incumbent industry, you're used to thinking about, I've got a product that I might sell either to another business or to a consumer directly, and I know that if I go and sell that product to a new market, I'll be able to generate X, so I'll go and look at a new geography, I'll go and maybe acquire a business that's got some market there, or I will be able to get better value from the way that I can deliver a better customer experience, I can digitize something, I can process. Those are all about doing today's business better. But if you want to really turn the world upside down in your thinking, with APIs, you're actually thinking about doing different business altogether. You're actually saying, if we can create and unlock some value from the data and the systems that we have within and expose that as an API to be used by another organization in a way that we may never have imagined, if we can make that discoverable, then we might be able to unlock all of this opportunity. That it's quite easy for us sometimes to be able to think about that, but it's just hard to communicate it. And we're talking about organizations who are used to thinking of designing UX or designing a process improvement or designing a workflow change. But in fact, we're asking them to think very differently, turn this thing on its head, if you like. And another point I'll make is that business strategy is sometimes confused with API strategy. And this is where, for example, with API management, people often underestimate what the impact they'll look at saying, let's invest in new API tooling, and we'll assume that that investment in tooling will automatically deliver some savings somewhere. But usually it's actually quite a disconnected, it's an enabler. And this is things that I hear a lot from people who work in API management space, the governance, the tooling, and the tech, is they're actually not really realizing these benefits and they're struggling to be able to communicate with stakeholders. Because the stakeholders are going to be listening to those things about how to get better reach, how to get better return, how to reduce costs, improve the risk profile, perhaps be more sustainable, more adherence to their social goals and so on. And these are quite binary, but if you put in an API management system that provides much better security and governance around your API portfolio, and your engineers are safer at delivering a more safe solution, they're working faster, they're more productive, that may not actually mean that there are fewer of them. What it means that you might be able to get more features out of every dollar that you're investing in their time to deliver on APIs, and they're doing less paperwork, more actual hands-on code that are delivering to requirements that are meeting the strategy. What you're doing is getting more features for your investment. You're not actually lowering your operating costs. You only lower your operating costs if you actually remove headcount out of an organization, for example. So this tends to be a conversation that I find a need to have a lot with people who are looking at their world just from, for example, the systems and the processes that they follow. And the best ways that you can have these conversations to talk about what the API strategy means for you is by involving often groups that you may not normally have a lot of day-to-day involvement with, but they're all stakeholders in the space. Engineers, obviously, architects, etc. A lot of the teams on the right-hand side are the people that often get kind of forgotten, but I'd almost kind of go, when you're looking at getting an API brought to life or an API portfolio brought to life, you need to think about less of who needs to be involved and more about who doesn't need to be involved. Because if you're exposing information about the business for other people to consume and use in imaginative ways, of course you need to think about security. Of course you need to be able to design in a way that somebody beyond your team is going to need to use this. So you're designing very much for the future. You do need to be able to explain how it will be sustained and maintained over time, but there will be operations behind the scenes. You're providing an API to deliver a new customer onboarding experience. Well, what's all of the operations and business processes that are going around that? How is it being marketed? What are the legal implications of the way that you're presenting it? Do you have a new operating model in the business that you're going to need to support? What's that cost? All of these things are important. So if you're looking to connect strategy, you need to make sure that you can make your work on a day-to-day basis and developing on an API. How does that connect to the ecosystem that I'm part of, to the ecosystem that it can help us participate in? So I'm working on that insurance API, might be used in a mobility platform. What's that customer's experience and what might they be wanting to do with that data beyond? Follow those flows of value and make sure that you're kind of proficient in the different languages. Those are the things that we think make a difference. When it comes to making a justification in investment, remember that the things that, so we've got a strategy connection, but we're still needing to make sure that API-related work on a day-to-day basis gets funded. So organizations will often seek our help with helping communicate that internally. And I always go back to the stakeholders really only going, at the end of the day, justifying anything comes down to really, really simple things. What does it cost to do? How long is that going to take? What will it cost once it's done? What's the ongoing? And what will we get back from it and how? So these are questions that people will get through their justification. And yes, this is as relevant for APIs as it has been for anything else. For years and decades, whether you're investing in, you've been working in ERPs or CRMs or other types of SaaS solutions or tech, it's always the same people asking ultimately the same types of questions. The challenge in the API world is that you've also got to use it with that upside down ecosystem thinking that we were talking about earlier. So when people are trying to justify investment in APIs, API activities, a particular API product, they will invariably find that they are coming unstuck because they're also trying to explain and educate their stakeholders on what this whole API economy is about. And they're putting up that project and opportunity in, I hate saying competition, but at the end of the day, people are often bidding for a finite, a contained amount of resources. They're bidding for that against the next new piece of automation that's going to deliver on a whole lot of productivity savings. So the reality of API conversations versus AI excitement, and I have managed to go for half an hour without actually using that two-letter acronym, because everybody is talking about AI. It's almost that they're not talking about enough, I think, about the non-AI stuff. So when I have API economy conversations with people about what's really happening on the ground, Yes, this education is so important. All attending conferences like this is critical. But when it comes to the crunch of what's happening on the ground or at the coalface, day-to-day people are still worried about how do we keep things secure, how do we make sure that we get repeat funding, that we're not going too fast, that we've got the data right. And they still need to work on the language, on the teams, on all of the stuff that an agent doesn't do, but still allows us to actually run and organise and make change. And they're these sorts of people as well. These are the people that we're spending time with. So one of the, this is just a grab bag example of the types of ways people look at justifying projects. They might take a lens on the product or the engineering. So imagine this is a company that's beyond, scaling up. This maybe is our mobility platform business that has now taken this niche 55 to 80-year-old age group that they were working on, and now they're extending and out into other segments. These may be all of the sorts of things that that company is now thinking about as it scales are going to be delivered by better APIs, better API management. Of all of these types of things, so the arrow up could be you're making more of your APIs reusable, and arrow down is you're saving some cost or reducing some time, getting less technical debt. All of these are the same types of benefits we see in all sectors. But generally, the one that everybody thinks is the easiest headline, which is getting direct money in, is often only a small part, and it's sometimes the hardest one to justify. So if you want to earn the right to get continued ongoing funding, you need to be able to deliver benefits early, and often they are in these productivity types of things, which is why there is so much interest and excitement and pressure on us to realize these efficiency savings that are the promise of a lot of agentic AI, etc. But my view, there's still a lot of other things out there that we can go after. One of the things that to think about from stakeholders as we are looking and working with people on getting change approved is sometimes the incentive models for supporting something aren't exactly aligned. So people might have a drive in their department. They're working in, let's say, customer success in a particular segment. So let's go back to this insurance business focused on, they could have a product team that's all about car insurance. So if you go back to the ecosystem thinking, if they were offering car insurance products or a piece of those to be used in a different way in a different market, and for that API to be able to deliver some kind of saving, it's not a like for them to invest in that because their business is already earmarked, and so they might not be incentivized to encourage a conversation for that API development into repurposing it into a completely different sector because that's not the business that they're part of. There is a lot of impatience for results, and API impact, because it's often exploring in new territories, can take a lot longer to get a result than a quarterly, or sometimes now even 6 weekly feedback. Hence, the interest and excitement about the productivity saves, because those are often seen as very, very quick. And there's a lot of pressures from other types of things. So we need to help. What we find is people need to understand that API success is often playing a long game, and making sure that people understand that if one team is what we used to call the kind of the first patient in the hospital, paying for the infrastructure of all of that hospital in order for them to be treated, that really good API reuse, so developing something that everybody else can reuse, might mean that one team is kind of taking one for the team, as they'd say. They're putting the extra investment in that other people might then consume more easily. You're sometimes having to seek use cases that might not be obvious, and one of my other hobby horse subjects is we're in such a pressure to be very, very quick on coming up with an answer. We feel that if we don't get back immediately, if we don't rush something out from a prototype into testing, that we will be seen as slowing things down.
but I do think we need to take a breath and focus. So the justification things that we find work the best for people is start with what you can afford. Don't build, don't say, this is the system I want, say, this is the API management system I want, this is how much it's going to cost, I'll go and run around and find benefits. Start with what you actually think you can afford and work to that and show results with what you can afford. And work really hard on finding those benefits and be pretty diligent about whether the costs are made up or not. Someone reminded me this week on who is a stakeholder, a person that if you don't involve them can ruin your day. And I thought it was quite real. It's very easy to produce numbers that actually don't really stand up to scrutiny, which is why it's important that you understand that you can draw that right connection. So, lastly, going to talk about the other place where we find this communication is so important between where the technology solution can look obvious, and actually it's the conversation that is so important. I explained I lived in Australia for a long time. Australia, I discovered, has more unsealed roads as a higher percentage of roads without bitumen than India. As a percentage, India has more roads actually, even than a country the size of Australia. But because of the distances and because the population is largely in a small number of cities scattered around the edge, if you want to really see the outback and explore it, I've had the opportunity to do that, you go off-road. And a friend of mine had bought a new to them, off-road vehicle, and they were given a training course as part of it to go out and explore and the outback. And the guy who was giving, it was a guy, the gentleman who was giving the lecture about how to drive safely produced this object on the left. It's a diff lock, differential, and explained in quite a lot of detail how that all worked. The mechanical engineers and the car enthusiasts in the audience lapped it up. They absolutely loved it. Some of us were sitting there going, this doesn't actually help me understand which gears I need to be in on what type of road, in what sorts of conditions. If I had a little graph that just said, unsealed, don't go more than 70 Ks, diff lock on, gear between third and fifth, that would have made a lot more sense. If you compare that with another driving course I had an opportunity to do, which was just a half day, it came with the purchase of a new car, and it was all about safety. And the gentleman who ran that course started up with a question. He said, and he was very Australian, so I'll put the accent on. What's the most important safety feature in your car? What's the most important safety feature? And we all kind of went, brakes, whatever. He was going, tyres. The most important safety feature in a car is the tyres. It's the only thing that touches the road. He then showed us the profile of a tyre, and he explained that if the tyre pressure was low, the friction was too great, and you would end up, you didn't have enough friction, and so there's a real risk that you can not brake in time and you can cause an accident. But if you have your pressures at the right tightness, you'll be able to create that braking. So it was really simple, and it made me think that this is something that we often are challenged with in APIs. We will focus on, for some people, if we have an audience that is engineers who want to understand the mechanics of how an API works, yes, the goal is about safety, but it could be quite technical and quite detailed. But more and more, if you're looking to have your APIs consumed in other ecosystems, in other industries with different languages, you need to be thinking much more about any kind of driver. And that needs to be also clear that it's still about driving more safely, but it's also about keeping other road users safe. What does that, as an example, the Indian set you up platform was completely recreated, the great case study on this, where they thought about who it was that actually needed to be able to use and consume these APIs. The questions that we're always asking ourselves is, who might be the person that needs to use this. If they're a colleague, they understand the language of our company. If they are in a partner organization, they might be still part of our ecosystem and they're familiar with our contact and dialogue, but perhaps they're from somewhere very different. In the future, of course, could be an agent. And do we make it very clear as we're thinking about the designs and the use, what the actual purpose is for these APIs? And this, we found, needs to be a very circular and collaborative conversation. It's not something that you just hand over in a document and hope that a smart engineer will be able to translate the intention and the meaning, and in fact also be able to provide feedback in. So some of the things that are super important to remember in that API design and making sure that it's invested over the long term is that the design process is not one way. It involves this continuous feedback loop, and that customer may not be the traditional customer we think of. It may be an API consumer as an engineer, and we also need to ensure that the scaling of that product as we deploy and implement it isn't underestimated. What I'm finding more and more as I talk to organizations and other participants in the API economy, that they're now at the stage of having a mature or an established API portfolio. In fact, in some ways, it's too established and the number of APIs are exploding as they're trying to make sure that they have fewer and that they're better purposed, is they are underestimating the amount of work that they need to put into scaling. So they've got to launch. They might have even had a regulatory need to do so, open banking, for example. Now they need to hold the line on all of the good practices around security and disciplines and risk management, and the cost of scaling, even though that's often infrastructure at a soft cost, actually understanding how it grows is huge. I do think that we need to, in this API urgency to get APIs built, designed, and used and consumed, let's just make sure that we are not just moving fast and breaking too much, that we're actually really thinking about some of the nuance and subtlety. So might be what's so encouraging and exciting to be in a place like here is how much there is to be positive about in terms of the growth and understanding and potential of what you're doing at a government type of level. India Stack proves that APIs aren't just integration tools, that they really are these national enablers. And when you design APIs as public infrastructure, they can scale, they can deliver trust and access and opportunity to the largest population in the world. And the rest of the world is watching you and watching this model and seeing what they can do at the pace and energy and enthusiasm that such a young country can achieve. Young is in terms of socio-demographic distribution. I come from Britain and Australia, where the aging population is another big social issue. So there's really big stuff happening all over. We're all part of that already. But we do need to still, as the Aussies would say, sweat the small stuff when it comes to being across the detail on day-to-day API decisions. We need to stay safe. We need to make sure the security is right. We need to keep the risk managed. And as we do scale, we need to understand that that comes with responsibility. So last of all, I would just say, stay safe. Think about what you're doing from a technological and a psychological perspective. So thank you very much for being here today. Thank you to Naresh and Mehdi for hosting us. If you'd like to know more about me, I'd love to hear your questions now, or connect with me on LinkedIn. Find me for the rest of today or at the workshop that we're running tomorrow on actually how to do some of this detailed work behind the scenes with getting people on board with API products. I've got an ebook that, if you're interested, has a lot of hints and tips. And we're running an API Economy Summit program from here. So thank you very much.